That night caught me completely off guard, yet it remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Darkness had enveloped the quiet suburban neighborhood, and the rhythmic ticking of my bedside clock was the sole sound in the stillness of my room. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the moon's faint glow filtering through the curtains and casting elongated shadows across the floor. Sleep evaded me, despite my exhaustion. It had been a long, emotionally draining day, where everything felt slightly amiss, yet I couldn't pinpoint the reason. I adjusted under the covers, drawing them closer as if they could somehow alleviate the unease that had clung to me all day. My phone vibrated softly beside me. A message from Dylan, my stepbrother. "You okay?" It read. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to respond. Dylan had been acting strangely lately, more withdrawn and distant. We'd always been close growing up, sharing countless summers filled with laughter and secrets. But since our parents' marriage, something had shifted between us. I couldn't discern if it was the altered family dynamic or something more profound, more personal. Before I could reply, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. The sound of muffled, hesitant footsteps slowly approached my door. My heart quickened, though I couldn't explain why. It was probably just someone getting a drink or going to the bathroom. But the footsteps stopped right outside my door, lingering as if waiting for permission to enter. I feigned sleep, the tension in the air palpable. The door remained closed, and after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated down the hall. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I turned over, checking the time. Almost 1 a.m. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it. This was absurd. There was nothing unusual happening. I was just being paranoid. But sleep still wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there, eyes wide open, attuned to every creak and groan of the old house. Finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. My slumber was short-lived. Sometime in the early morning hours I became aware of something, or rather someone in the room. I couldn't explain it, but there was a presence nearby, looming. I attempted to move, but my body felt heavy, my limbs unresponsive. It was as though I was trapped in a bizarre dreamlike state, both awake and asleep simultaneously. I felt the sheets shift, the subtle weight of someone beside me. My breath hitched, but I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then I felt it. A touch, light and tentative, grazing my arm. My skin prickled with fear, and 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Who was here? What were they doing? But it didn't stop. The touch grew bolder, moving slowly down my arm, then gently across my back. I yearned to scream, to shout, to demand that they stop, but the paralysis held me captive. Then I heard a whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Shh." It was Dylan's voice. I struggled to process what was happening. Dylan? My stepbrother? My mind reeled as I lay there, frozen, unable to move. The warmth of his breath brushed against my neck, and I felt his hand hesitate for a second, as if questioning his own actions. The moment stretched on endlessly, but he didn't stop. His fingers trailed down my spine, the thin fabric of my pajama top offering little protection from the sensation. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't speak, couldn't open my eyes to confront him. My body had betrayed me, locking me in this nightmare with no escape. I couldn't understand why. Why was he doing this? We'd grown up together. This was Dylan, my stepbrother, the same person who used to tease me relentlessly, who would laugh at my clumsy attempts to keep up with him as kids. There had never been anything inappropriate between us, not even close. So why now? As his hand lingered on my waist, I felt a conflicting storm of emotions. Confusion, fear, even a disturbing mix of anger and shame. My heart pounded, and I wanted to flee the room, to make sense of this twisted game he was playing, but my body refused to cooperate. He leaned closer, his breathing quickening, mirroring the frantic beat of my own heart. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, and I wondered if this was some kind of twisted dream. Maybe I was imagining it all. Maybe my mind, exhausted and stressed, was playing tricks on me. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Dylan withdrew his touch, vanishing as if it had never been there. I heard the faint rustling of sheets and the mattress shift as he rose. The soft sound of his footsteps drifted back toward the door. My body remained paralyzed, and I waited, my breath shallow and ragged, as he left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. For a long time I remained frozen, trying to comprehend what had just transpired. The silence of the house pressed down on me, but my thoughts were too loud, too chaotic to find any peace. I wanted to confront him, demand an explanation. But how could I? What if I had imagined the whole thing? What if I was wrong? But deep down, I knew it. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back into a restless sleep, though the memory of Dylan's touch lingered, haunting me throughout the night. The next morning, my alarm clock's angry buzzing jerked me awake. The events of the previous night came flooding back, twisting my stomach into a cold knot of anxiety. I sat up, the room bathed in the soft light of dawn. It felt like any other day, yet everything had changed. Dylan's door was closed when I stepped into the hallway. I hesitated, staring at it, wondering if he was awake, if he remembered, if he regretted what had happened. I descended the stairs, attempting to push the thoughts aside. But when I entered the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table, casually scrolling through his phone as if nothing had occurred. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he glanced up at me with his usual calm, easy smile. "Morning," he said, his voice light and normal. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing, but forced myself to reply, "Morning." I avoided looking directly at him as I busied myself making coffee, my hands trembling as I tried to steady them. The silence between us was oppressive, but Dylan acted as if nothing had changed, as if we were still the same stepbrothers we'd always been. But I knew better. I sat at the far end of the table, my eyes fixed on the mug in front of me, but I could feel his gaze, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. How could I even begin to explain what I thought had happened? How could I accuse him if I wasn't absolutely certain? And yet, deep inside, I was sure. I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the memory of his breath against my neck, but saying it out loud would change everything, and I wasn't ready. Just when the tension became unbearable, he stood up, stretching lazily. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. I nodded, barely managing a response. He lingered in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then left without another word. As soon as the door clicked shut, I exhaled sharply, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My mind was racing. What was I supposed to do? Confront him? Pretend it never happened? One thing was clear. I couldn't ignore it. And there was more to come. The day dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't stop replaying the previous night's events, searching for an explanation, a reason, anything that could make sense of it. But I always arrived at the same conclusion. Dylan had crossed a line, and I had to do something about it. But what? By evening, the house remained quiet. I'd spent the entire day on edge, flinching at every sound, half expecting Dylan to walk through the door and force a confrontation. But he didn't return. As the hours passed, a creeping sense of dread settled in. What was I supposed to say when I saw him again? How was I supposed to act? Could I pretend everything was normal, like he had? Or would I confront him, demand answers, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them? The tension was unbearable. Finally, as the sun began to set, I heard the familiar creak of the front door opening. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze where I stood, halfway to the kitchen. His footsteps were soft, deliberate, as if he was trying to be quiet. I turned slowly, just in time to see Dylan standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on mine. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. My mouth went dry, and the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. "Hey," he said, his voice almost too casual, as if nothing had changed. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look away. "Hey!" He dropped his bag on the floor and leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that same unreadable expression I had come to dread. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to say something. Anything. "I need to talk to you," I blurted out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound calm. His eyes flickered with something. Surprise? Guilt? But he quickly masked it with a lazy smile. "Okay, what's up?" I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I struggled to find the right words. How could I confront him about what happened without everything spiraling out of control? But there was no easy way to say it, no simple way to bring up what he'd done last night. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "You came into my room, didn't you?" His expression shifted ever so slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes dark, unreadable. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, his tone steady, controlled. My stomach churned. Was he going to deny it? Was he going to pretend like nothing had happened? I had to keep going, had to push through the fear and confusion that threatened to paralyze me. "I wasn't imagining it," I said, my voice firmer this time. "You were there. I know it was you." Dylan's jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw a crack in his calm facade. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if assessing my seriousness. When he spoke, his voice was lower, almost a challenge. "What are you going to do about it?" The room seemed to spin, my breath hitching in my throat. His words hung in the air, sharp and menacing, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was it, the moment that would determine everything. "I just want to know why," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why would you do something like that?" For a moment Dylan looked away, unable to meet my gaze. The silence stretched, each second more agonizing than the last, until finally he spoke. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight, almost strangled. "I don't know why I did it." His confession lingered between us, heavy and raw. I felt a confusing blend of relief and anger rising within me. Relief that he hadn't denied it, that I hadn't imagined it all, but the anger simmered beneath, intensifying with each passing moment. "That's not good enough," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You can't just say you don't know." But before I could finish, he interrupted, his voice rising, sharp and defensive. "You think I wanted to do that?" he snapped, his face contorted with something I couldn't quite decipher. Guilt, shame, perhaps both. "You think I don't hate myself for it? It just happened, okay?" I wasn't thinking. His words struck me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. I had craved answers, but now that I had them, they only worsened the situation. This wasn't a simple mistake he could dismiss. This wasn't something he could easily explain away. "I've been dealing with a lot lately," Dylan continued, his voice softening, almost pleading. "Everything's been messed up since our parents got married. I don't know how to deal with it." I stared at him, trying to comprehend his words, to make sense of the chaos we were in. But nothing he said could justify his actions. Nothing could erase the memory of his touch, the way he had crossed a line that should have remained inviolable. "I don't care what's going on with you," I said, my voice cold, my hands shaking. "You had no right to do that to me." He winced, as if my words had caused him physical pain, but I didn't relent. I couldn't. This wasn't just about him. It was about what he had done to me, and I wouldn't let him off the hook so easily. "I know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. The silence following his apology was unbearable. His words hung in the air, but they didn't bring the comfort I had longed for. It wasn't enough, not after what he had done. He stood there, eyes downcast, his entire demeanor collapsing under the weight of his guilt. I wanted to speak, to say anything that would make sense of this, that would mend what was broken between us. But how could I? There were no words powerful enough to repair the gaping hole torn through our relationship. "I don't know what you want me to do," Dylan finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't take it back. I can't undo it." I looked at him, truly looked at him. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw the truth in his eyes, the regret, the shame, the fear of losing everything he had taken for granted. But even that didn't excuse his actions, couldn't erase the violation I had felt in the darkness of the night when I thought I was safe. "I need space," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I need time to figure this out." Dylan's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of defeat. He didn't argue, didn't plead for forgiveness. He simply nodded, eyes still averted, and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he hesitated, glancing back at me with a look of apology and desperation. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I hope you can believe that." But I couldn't, not yet, maybe not ever. I didn't respond as he walked out, the soft click of the door echoing in the hollow silence. The tension eased slightly with his departure, but it didn't vanish completely. I could still feel it clinging to the walls, lingering in the spaces between the memories we had shared before everything went wrong. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my mind racing. How was I supposed to move on from this? How could I ever look at him the same way again? The person I had grown up with, trusted, even loved in the way only stepbrothers could, had shattered all of that in one night, and I couldn't piece it back together, no matter how desperately I wanted to. Hours blurred by as I sat there, staring into space, letting the weight of what had happened crush me. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. That night had changed everything, and I wasn't sure if we could ever recover. But life didn't stop just because my world had been upended. The sun had long since set, and the house had fallen into an uneasy quiet. It was only then that I realized how long I'd been sitting there, lost in thought. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since morning, but the thought of food made me nauseous. I couldn't stay here, not tonight. I needed to get out, to breathe, to think without the walls of this house closing in on me. Grabbing my phone and keys, I left, not bothering to. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even myself. I just had to be somewhere, anywhere else but here. The cool night air brushed my face as I stepped outside, and for a fleeting second, a wave of calm washed over me. I inhaled deeply, trying to clear my thoughts, but the memory of Dylan's touch, his voice, the unspoken tension between us, lingered. It was as if it had become a part of me, a constant reminder of what had transpired. I walked aimlessly, my feet guiding me through the quiet neighborhood streets. Overhead, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement, the distant hum of traffic the only sound breaking the stillness. I needed to think, to unravel the tangled mess I was in, but no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, nothing could justify what had happened. Eventually, I found myself at the small park near the edge of the neighborhood, deserted, as expected at this hour. I wandered over to the swings, the same ones Dylan and I used to play on as kids. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd shared so many happy memories here, laughing and teasing each other like brothers. Now, here I was, grappling with the reality that the person I had trusted most had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I sat on one of the swings, the chains creaking softly as I swayed back and forth. The familiar motion was somewhat comforting, but it did little to calm the turmoil within me. My mind kept returning to the same question. What now? Could I face my parents? Could I tell them what Dylan had done? The thought filled me with dread. How would they react? Would they believe me? Or would they side with Dylan, the golden boy who could do no wrong in their eyes? The weight of the decision pressed down on me. I didn't want to shatter our family, to tear apart the fragile peace we had built. But I couldn't keep this secret either. It was too heavy, too painful. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened with a mixture of anger, fear, and sadness. I don't know how long I sat there lost in thought. The gentle creak of the swing, the only sound in the quiet night, seemed to blur the passage of time until I finally felt the chill seeping into my bones. I stood up, rubbing my arms for warmth, and started the slow walk back home. The house was dark when I returned. I slipped inside quietly, hoping to avoid any further confrontations. As I climbed the stairs, I paused outside Dylan's door. It was closed, the soft sound of his breathing barely audible. For a moment I considered knocking, considered trying to talk to him, but I couldn't. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh, too raw. I needed time. We both did. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly behind me. The darkness enveloped me, but this time it offered no comfort. It felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in, pressing down on me with the weight of everything that had happened. I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me as if they could somehow shield me from the reality I was living. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. The days ahead stretched before me, filled with uncertainty, fear, and the overwhelming question of what to do next. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I knew this was only the beginning. And it was. The story didn't end there. The following days were a blur. Time passed, but I was barely present. I went through the motions, waking up, pretending everything was fine, avoiding Dylan as much as possible. Our parents seemed oblivious to the change in the atmosphere between us, but I felt it in every interaction, in every awkward silence at the dinner table, in every fleeting glance that held too much unspoken tension. Dylan avoided me too. We shared the same roof, but it felt like we were living in different worlds. I could see the guilt weighing on him, evident in his every movement. He wasn't the same carefree, confident Dylan I'd grown up with. He seemed smaller, quieter, always watching me from the corner of his eye, as if waiting for the inevitable confrontation. I couldn't keep up the pretense forever. The more I tried to bottle everything up, the heavier it became. I spent hours lying awake at night, replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of it all. But I couldn't. Every time I thought I had found a way to cope, a way to move forward, I would remember the feeling of his touch, the whisper of his voice, and it would all come crashing back. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever. The decision to tell someone weighed heavily on me. What would happen if I did? Would it destroy everything? Would our family fall apart? Or would it be the only way to start healing, to finally confront what had happened instead of burying it deeper each day? One night, after another sleepless bout of tossing and turning, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be pretty. But I couldn't live like this anymore, carrying the weight of Dylan's actions, pretending everything was fine, when it clearly wasn't. I had to talk to my parents. They deserved to know. The next morning, I waited until Dylan had left for work. I needed to do this without him present, without the weight of his presence hanging over the conversation. I found Mom in the kitchen, sipping coffee and flipping through a magazine, completely oblivious to the turmoil brewing just beneath the surface. I stood in the doorway for a long time, heart pounding, hands shaking. How could I possibly explain what had happened without tearing our family apart? How could I even say the words aloud? But I had to. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked up, smiling. "Hey, sweetie, you're up early." I nodded, my stomach churning. "Can we talk? It's important." Her smile faded, concern flickering across her face as she set down her mug. "Of course. What's going on?" I didn't know how to begin. I had no script, no rehearsed lines, just the raw, painful truth. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's about Dylan." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the concern deepening. "What about Dylan?" I swallowed hard, forcing the words out before I lost my nerve. Something happened. Something that shouldn't have. Her face paled, and she leaned forward, her voice suddenly serious. "What do you mean? What happened?" Tears pricked my eyes, but I fought them back. I had to be strong. I had to get through this. That night, a few weeks ago, he came into my room while I was sleeping. She didn't speak for a moment, her expression frozen in shock. I could see her trying to process what I was saying, the pieces slowly clicking into place. Then she asked, her voice barely audible, "Did he—" I looked down at my hands, my throat tightening. "He touched me, Mom. It wasn't right. It wasn't okay." The silence that followed was unbearable. Mom just sat there, staring at me as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I couldn't tell if she was angry, hurt, or just shocked. Maybe all three. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I blinked, the tears finally breaking free. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to ruin everything. I didn't want to tear our family apart." Mom stood up, crossed the room, and pulled me into a tight hug. I could feel her body trembling, her breath shaking against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." We stood there for what felt like hours, both of us trying to come to terms with the reality of what had happened. I had dreaded this moment, feared that it would break us, but instead I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as if a weight had finally been lifted. But it wasn't over. There was still Dad, and the truth had to come out. When Dad returned from work later that evening, Mom sat him down and explained everything. The look on his face, the shock, the disbelief, the anger, was almost too much to bear. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't believe that his son, Dylan, would do something like that. But the truth was undeniable. Confronting Dylan was the hardest part. Dad demanded answers, but Dylan barely spoke. He stood there, head hanging low as my parents laid into him, their voices trembling with anger and disappointment. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He just kept saying he was sorry, over and over again. But sorry wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase what he had done. It wasn't enough to fix the broken trust between us. And it wasn't enough to heal the pain that now lingered in every corner of our home. That night, Dylan packed his things and left. He moved out, giving us the space we all desperately needed. I didn't know where he went, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that things would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, a strange sense of peace settled over the house. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but there was healing. Slowly, my parents and I began to pick up the pieces, to talk openly about what had happened, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It took time, tears, and uncomfortable conversations. There were moments when everything still felt wrong, but we made it through. We survived. As for Dylan, I didn't speak to him for a long time. I needed the distance, the space to figure out who I was without the shadow of that night looming over me. It wasn't until months later that I received a letter from him, a letter filled with apologies, regret, and promises to never cross that line again. I read it, but I didn't respond. Healing, true healing, takes time. I told myself I'd respond later, but I never have.